Going to give today's webinar really on some of the background of alienation and the emotional power that's involved, because essentially we're looking at the emotional power of bullies is how children become alienated. And so let me get started. Because I'm a mental health professional and a family lawyer, I try to look at this from both sides. Although I'm no longer practicing either of those professions, what I'm doing now is consultation to give people strategies and ideas. But that's the role that I'm in. So just real briefly, I'm co-founder and chief innovation officer of High Conflict Institute. We started this in 2008, Megan Hunter and I. She worked with the Arizona Supreme Court for 15 years on family law matters. And I've been a family lawyer for 28 years. Before that, 12 years as a therapist. So we put our heads together really about how to train professionals. And that's been our primary focus. But what's exciting about speaking to you folks with Family Access is really sharing with parents and grandparents and professionals some of the same information that we teach professionals in seminars. So let's focus first basically on the emotional process. So bullying really seems to be the problem. And this is what people understand. They understand bullies like to dominate people and influence them. But what most people don't understand is most of the power of bullies is unseen, is hidden, because it's emotional power. So let's look at this. And I think of this as primitive emotional power. This is when people have a win-lose approach to life. And in modern society, we know that we need to have win-win relationships where everybody benefits, and that's the happiest relationships in the workplace, with neighbors, and in families. It's hard to have it where somebody loses in a family. Now, what we're seeing with alienation is that some people seem to have win-lose personalities, and they approach all relationships as adversarial. And so when it comes to the children, they feel the children have to take sides, and the children absorb that message emotionally. Many parents who engage in alienating behaviors don't sit down with the children and say, now I want you to hate your father, or I want you to hate your mother. Instead, what happens is it's a lot of little behaviors. And my theory, I'm not going to go into it a lot here, but my theory I call 1,000 little bricks. It's lots of little alienating behaviors that add up to a wall between the child and one of the parents. So let's look at the emotions. So the emotions tend to create conflict, crisis, chaos, and fear. And this, by the way, isn't really conscious for the people doing this. I'm going to explain they may have traits of or personality disorders, which is what I've been studying the last 40 years as a therapist and a family lawyer. But they automatically tend to create conflict because of that adversarial way of thinking of all relationships, win-lose. They go through a lot of crises because things are emotion-driven, and so problems come out of that. They create chaos and they create fear. And that gets passed to the children, and I'll talk about how that happens. But at the same time, they have an appearance of confidence and strength, which is one of the primitive emotional powers that we as human beings are susceptible to. So we're attracted to people who seem confident and strong, even if they're not accurate. And so what we see is a lot of people we call high conflict personalities have very strong emotions and look very confident. They're very certain. And that's very appealing. And it's also appealing to children who aren't sure what's happening in the world. And so when someone's sure, that's very attractive to them. Now, what happens is a parent who has these high conflict traits or personality disorder traits, but sees things through a win-lose lens, is that they're bullies, and that the bully part of it is the story that they have. And the bully story has three parts: that there's a terrible crisis, that there's an evil villain, and there's a hero. Well, what we're seeing today with alienating behaviors is often it's a fantasy crisis. And so, since I work primarily with divorce, what we see in divorce is they see the divorce as a fantasy crisis of, oh my goodness, it has to be somebody's fault. And so the crisis is this evil person, the other parent, has caused this terrible thing, often a divorce. And so they view a divorce as a crisis, and part of their personality may be related to that. That I can't handle this, so I'm going to blame the other person. And it's not even a conscious process. They feel it deep in their bones, and yet it's not accurate. Nothing is all one person's fault, but they see it that way. So the crisis, say, is the divorce, and they'll see the evil villain as the other parent. And so they'll say to the child, the other parent caused the divorce. It's their fault. I remember one case where I heard that I think it was mother said, father wanted an abortion, wanted me to have an abortion, but I had you instead. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a terrible thing to say to a child, that the parent didn't want them and wanted them to be aborted. And yet that's the thing that spills out of high conflict people's mouths, is the most angry, hateful, negative things. So the child absorbs this divorce as a crisis. And for most people, say 80% of people going through a divorce, it's a sad and uncomfortable transition in life, but it isn't a crisis that's caused by one person. So the child picks up, this is a terrible crisis, and it's all caused by the evil villain, who's the other parent. And the hero is the parent who's telling me all these stories. Now, one of the things, and I got questions, and they're good questions, is what about when they say that you're the bully, but the person saying it is the bully? We see this in domestic violence cases where someone's violent and they say the other person is causing all the problems. So part of the bully's story is that the bully has it backwards. And in many ways, they don't see that they're being a bully. And so they're telling the child all these things because they think it's true that the other person is evil and caused all the problems, whatever they are. And the problems that as life goes on may be, well, he doesn't give me the money that he's supposed to for support, or she takes all my money and spends it, so I don't have any money to help you kids. And one of the things I want to say right away is this isn't a gender issue. I've represented many mothers who the child's been alienated against, as well as fathers who the child's been alienated against. So understanding, though, the bully story is backwards, but the person believes it and they pass it on to the child emotionally. And that's the focus of this presentation, is how this emotional transfer occurs. So emotional repetition is how we learn. Do you remember how you learned English? If your English is your language, you're probably, I know there's something like 40 countries that follow these Sunday night programs. And I'm sure some people English is a second language. But how did you learn your language? No one sat down and said, okay, Johnny, you're 3 years old now and you're going to learn the language. No, you absorb it from the people around you. And so emotional words get the most attention. And so kids often, 3, 4, 5 will blurt out some swear words And parents go, whoa, where did you get that? Well, the child doesn't even remember where they got it. But what they learned is those words have a lot of emotional power. And so everyone gets upset, or maybe everybody just laughs. But the idea is emotional words carry more power and we remember them more. Advertising is like this. You know, you'll get rich if you subscribe to whatever it is, Publishers Clearinghouse or something. And so it's the emotions that stick in your brain. And that's what's important here. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, what's particularly powerful is emotional repetition, words with emotional power repeated in isolation. So the person is only hearing these words and they're not hearing any contradictory words. So in many ways, what we're seeing is really children absorb prejudice against the other parent emotionally. So the things they hear, they just see, say, mom is sad. And they know the cause of mom's sadness is dad. And so they're angry at dad. Or a friend of mine, a professional about 50 years old, went through her parents' divorce. And she remembers, she said, I think she was about 12 when this happened. And they would go and spend weekends with dad. And dad was really sad. And he'd be often tearful. But he wouldn't say what it was about. But she said, we knew it was because of our mothers wanting the divorce. And dad was sad about divorce. So we blamed our mother, even though our dad didn't blame our mother, but his emotions were so intense that they absorbed something's wrong here. There's a crisis. And the evil villain in that case was mom because she made dad so sad. And so emotions are what we're driving at, not what people overtly said. And that's important, and especially when you get into court cases, judges often think there's something that parents said that turned them against the other parent, when in many ways, the parent's just doing all these emotional things obliviously. And so that's part of what has to get addressed. Now, I'm going to also mention here that bullies want advocates, that they want people to help in their point of view. And so if you have, say, a high conflict divorce and it's going to court, the bully is going to be talking to a lot of people about how awful you are. And that this may include a parent, this may include grandparents, that it's a global thing, this emotional rejection of a parent and a whole family. So we see the child rejecting the parent, the grandparents, the pet, the house, all of that, because it's so emotionally intense. And when I say this is like a prejudice against the other parent, it's learned similar to the way other forms of prejudice are learned. We don't learn group and ethnic and racial prejudice by being sat down and told to dislike certain people. We learn it through the facial expressions, the hand gestures, the jokes, all of that we absorb emotionally. And by 5 or 6, a lot of kids have already absorbed who's in the out group, who's in the in group. And by say 9 or 10, if that's mom or dad, they already know how to do that. They know how to reject somebody because it's an emotionally intense message. Now, 80% of parents, maybe 90%, don't share that level of emotional intensity with their kids that's so negative about the other parent. But let's say 15% of parents do have lack of emotional control, and they have that intensity which turns the kids against the other parent. So we'll talk about personalities in a little bit. But just keep in mind that they absorb negative advocates. These are other people who are emotionally hooked but uninformed. They may be other family members. They may be friends. They may be neighbors. They may be co-workers. But you'll find that they're always talking to people about how rotten you are, and that those emotional words come through. And even if they're not saying those words, if their emotions come through, sadness, anger, and get associated with you, then you get rejected for these emotional reasons. So negative advocates escalate cases into higher emotions. So if a child is around a parent who's engaged in alienating behaviors, they may engage other family members to also see, let's say it's dad is the evil villain. They may see dad as it's all his fault. He's a terrible guy. I never want him around my grandson again or something. You might hear that. I had a divorce case like that. A woman came in, she was about 40, and she brought her father to the law office. He was about 65. And she said, I want him to sit in. He's helping pay for all this. And I said, well, I need to meet with you alone as a lawyer first to keep confidentiality. Then we'll bring your father in. And then brought the father in. The father says, I never want that SOB ex-husband to be around my grandson. I think he's a jerk, and look how upset he made my daughter. And the daughter's like, well, yeah. And I said, well, you know that the courts don't like to exclude a parent. They want shared parenting, significant parenting time for both parents. And so if we're supposed to try to win not having contact with the other parent, we're going to have psychological research, legal research, et cetera, as to why this should be the case. Because as I could see, it was all emotional. There was no history of abuse against dad, but there was this emotional all or nothing. And that's characteristic of high conflict personalities. And so I said, so you're probably looking about $50,000. Well, the grandfather, 65-year-old father of the client for me, was horrified. I said, oh my goodness. So let me talk to my daughter alone for a few minutes. They talk alone for a few minutes, come back, say, I think that thing you said about negotiating parenting time is probably the better way for us to go. And I said, yeah, and that's also good for your child. So that's the idea, though. Some people are so emotionally wrapped up with it that they want to have all or nothing approach, and that those emotions pass on to other people in the family. So you get what Janet Johnston calls tribal warfare. So you get one whole family against the other parent and that parent's whole family. And so it's really tragic. But what's driving this seems to be these emotions. And often the people having these emotions don't even understand them, but it drives their behavior. Now you get professionals involved. And so sometimes you get professionals also speaking and talking as though the other parent, perhaps you, the people I'm talking to, is the evil villain. And that doesn't help. Professionals need to really manage their emotions in these cases, because even though they're upsetting and disturbing, you make it worse. And I would say most of the alienation cases I've had that were in court got progressively worse as we went through the court process, because the emotions of everyone being upset and angry, the judge is angry, he yells at the parents are angry at each other, they yell at the child. And what happens is the child absorbs the emotional messages coming from professionals if they have a parent who doesn't have emotional boundaries. So if a parent come home and say, the judge was angry today. He's angry at, let's say, at your mother. So let's say in this case, the father's doing the alienating behaviors. The judge was angry at your mother and said this is all her fault. And lets that just spill right out. The kids go, huh, I wonder, maybe mom's not that great after all. And so children absorb professionals' emotions when they have a parent who doesn't have emotional boundaries. So professionals can sometimes be part of the problem. This could be therapists, this could be lawyers, this could be others. So professionals that are listening need to pay more attention to managing their emotions in these cases, because it ends up landing on the kids. Evaluators sometimes get hooked, and I've read many psychological evaluations where they talk about, say, one parent's been acting really badly, and then they suddenly excuse all that behavior in their recommendations. And I'm going, it doesn't fit the description of the behavior before the recommendations. So I think this person got emotionally hooked by the emotions of the high conflict parent, who could be very charming, but also may have said, I'm a victim. Remember, the bully's story is a backward story, it's reversed. So the person who's the bully is really saying they're the victim, when in fact they're not, but they're making the other parent, who really is the victim of this rejection, alienation, bullying, they're making that person out to be the problem. And so evaluators may see a fairly reasonable parent as being really the problem, and or seeing a high conflict parent who's engaged in alienating behaviors not as a problem at all, and may say, okay, we're going to give them a break here. And so they proceed and they continue, and the child becomes more and more alienated rather than less. And of course, judges get emotionally hooked too. I think of a case I had where the father was alienating against the mother, and he'd also been physically abusive. He beat her up about 60 times, no, about 40 times in the 6-year marriage they had. And then they had a 6-year-old son. When I got into the case, over the next 10 years, the father kept coming back to court to try to get total control of the son. And he'd had total control of the mother. The mother ended up with 2/3 of the parenting time, but he kept talking to the son in disparaging terms about the mother. And then the mother had a new boyfriend, and he really had disparaging remarks about that. Mind you, the court has an order saying that neither parent shall make disparaging remarks about the other parent in the presence of the child. But high conflict people can't restrain themselves. And so they'll say anything like this. So he'll make disparaging remarks. And over the course of the next 10 years, that's what he did. And he undermined the mother, who had the majority of parenting time, to the point that the boy became alienated against the mother, ran away to the father at 16 and said he refused to see his mother. And so you could just see this evolving over the years. And yet the father, even though he had less parenting time, kept coming back to court, kept blaming the mother for this and that. That really wasn't true. He was even sanctioned. I had him sanctioned. He had to pay $3,000 for the mother's attorney's fees for one of these unnecessary hearings. But it didn't stop him, and he kept telling things to the boy that eventually alienated against the primary custodial parent, because he did it intensely emotionally. And she was a fairly quiet person. She was careful to follow the rules, didn't speak negatively of the father. And so he really had a powerful impact emotionally. Now, I would say at court, in this particular case, each year, the father had a new girlfriend. And I remember one year the girlfriend coming up to me and saying, it was after like 8 years of being in court, saying, Mr. Eddy, you're so hard on my boyfriend. You just don't understand him. And I was just thinking, I didn't say it, But the thought that went through my mind, yeah, and next year, the new girlfriend the next year will say the same thing, because he couldn't manage reasonable relationships and kept going through new girlfriends, every year a new one, and they became negative advocates for him. And so they would argue for him because he's very charming on the surface, but under the surface, he saw all relationships as adversarial. So let's talk about how emotions are contagious. So there's a lot of research now on this, and it's really fascinating. And I think people involved in cases, alienation cases, especially if you're a professional, you want to look into some of these articles. But one of the key things here is anxiety. And high conflict parents are quite anxious. And so that anxiety transfers to the kids. But here's a quote. This was from a good book on social intelligence. This is the guy who wrote the first book on emotional intelligence. It says, anxiety heightens emotional transactions. So when someone's anxious, there's more emotions flowing, and people who feel threatened and anxious are especially prone to catching other people's emotions. So when you have someone creating an anxious situation, there's more likely that the emotions are contagious. And so think of an angry, anxious parent, and the child around them is more likely to absorb that parent's emotions, not less likely, and totally unconsciously, not even aware that it's happening. And here's how the process seems to work. So there's really two steps with emotions, going from one person to the next. The first is what they call emotional contagion, which is an automatic process to mimic other people's facial expressions, tone of voice, body process, body language, etc. So emotional contagion is basically a mirroring of other people's behavior and emotions. But then there's emotion regulation. And this is the process by which people influence their emotions. And so how they experience emotions coming from other people can be regulated. And we learn this as adults. We learn this especially as teenagers growing up, is how to regulate emotions. So if someone's really angry at you, your mirroring effect, your kind of body automatic stuff, your brain wants to mirror them and just be equally angry. And you see a lot of that. You see that in the movies, you see that in real life, is people getting angry at each other because they're mirroring each other's anger. Well, a lot of times as adults, like if you say you've got a 5-year-old child and they're angry at you and you're the parent, you're not just going to get angry back. You're going to say, Johnny, you need to calm down. You know, let's look at what you can do now. Rather than arguing and yelling and being angry back, parents regulate their emotions. Well, most parents regulate their emotions. Some have emotion dysregulation, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the emotions you can influence the older you get, but as a young child, you really don't have that emotion regulation yet. So when you've got a parent who's really angry and upset about the other parent, you're going to absorb that as a child, basically straight in. You're going to mirror that emotion. And maybe it's just mom or dad is crying or mom and dad is yelling, but they're not saying anything about who it's about. Well, the child absorbs that and they figure that out. So if you think of this as 3 steps, there's emotional contagion. Somebody expresses upset, angry emotions. They're saying the other parent's doing everything wrong. And so physiologically, your brain is mirroring that, saying, oh, everything must be wrong. Then emotion regulation. Well, as a child, you don't really have that yet. But as you start getting older, you start learning that. So the mood state could be quite different from the emotions coming at you the older you are, the more you're able to manage that. So cognitive appraisal is what you tell yourself, I don't have to get upset about this. And one thing we teach, we have a method called New Ways for Families, which I'll mention later in the program, teaches that emotions are contagious and teaches parents to tell their kids, you don't have to have the same emotions that I have. And so explicitly stating that really helps. But the parents that engage in alienating behaviors aren't conscious of that and don't say that. In fact, they want the child to have the same emotions, and we see that resulting. So cognitive reappraisal is what you tell yourself. Expression suppression is what you show. So let's say you're angry at your boss, but you don't want to get fired. So you're not going to walk into your boss and say, I'm angry at you. You're going to walk into your boss and say, how was your weekend? And you suppress your emotion, and that helps you keep your job. Well, we do that all the time if we're dealing with the public, etc. But people without good emotion regulation don't do that. So they're expressing a lot of the time intense negative emotions, anger, fear, hurt, jealousy, all of that. And so that passes to a child. So we just see these steps. And that's why adults often don't understand alienation, because they go, well, why doesn't the child just ignore what the parent says about the other parent or how the parent feels about the other parent? Well, the child can't. They don't have the ability yet to ignore intense emotions. And that's what this is all about, is intense emotions. Now, just real briefly, how does that happen? So the amygdala in the brain, it's in the middle part of the brain. You actually have one in each hemisphere. We'll see a picture of somebody's fearful looking face. And if they have them in an fMRI, that's a machine, it's a magnetic resonance imaging like they have at hospitals to test, if everything's working. Well, they look at blood flow and they look at their brains, and the brains of people looking at fearful looking faces in pictures look just as frightened as people who are frightened. And so it's a more muted range, but we absorb emotions even from pictures. So certainly television, movies, Facebook, all of that we absorb, which is a good reason to limit kids' exposure to the negative stuff on these images, if you can. But the amygdala spots signs of fear in someone's face as quickly as 33 milliseconds. That's 33 thousandths of a second. So fast that the conscious mind remains oblivious to that. And this is true for adults too, that your amygdala can pick up somebody's fearful face instantly and maybe realize I have to run or I have to fight. Well, so this is happening to kids over and over again with parents with alienating emotions, with intense emotions. Now, the right amygdala and the right part of the brain seems to be more of the protective defensive process. May just this high-speed detection is totally unconscious. It just comes in, you feel it, and you act on it. So a child may see a parent looking afraid and just burst into tears, the child, because they're absorbing the fear of the parent. As they get older, they're more able to regulate that. But as a child, you're looking at not learning that. Adolescence is when you really start learning emotion regulation. So the right side, it's more automatic of the brain. The right brain is more absorbing all of this automatically. Now, this is a quote from Alan Shore. I've been to some of his seminars on the brain, and I'll try not to get too boring if this is the boring part for people. But I just want to show a picture from one of his books that I think really shows the idea. So the right brain of one person is communicating with the right brain of the other person. What's the language they're communicating? It's intense emotions. So anger. So anger from one person goes into the right brain of the other person, and now the other person's angry. So if you picture this as a parent and child, so you have a parent that's sharing a lot of intense emotions, which they shouldn't do, but let's say they are, on a regular basis, the child's absorbing that unconsciously. They're not even aware of what's happening. All they know is now they hate their other parent. They don't know why, because it's emotionally transferred. And I've had cases where, I represented a father and his daughter said, I don't ever want to see my father again. And that's like, why? Because I just don't like the way he wears his hair. He embarrasses me. So you don't want any relationship at all? No, absolutely none. Well, what's happening there is the right brain is feeling it emotionally, and the left brain's looking for reasons. It's the more logical brain, and looking for reasons. Why do I hate my father? Well, he does wear his hair kind of messy, so maybe that's why I hate my father. We'll give you another example, representing a mother. Son doesn't want to see his mother ever again. He's 12 years old. Why not? Well, she's no good at math. My father's good at math. My mother's no good at math. And you think, well, that's absurd. But that's the left brain trying to come up with a reason to fit the right brain emotion. So they've absorbed the intensity of the parent's dislike for the mother. They just don't know why, because they've absorbed it emotionally. So a big part of this particular presentation is to help you understand how the child learns alienation, and it's primarily emotional. Now, there may be activities that are interfered with, there may be blatant statements that are said, but the majority of alienating parents that I've ended up working with are really, they don't realize why the child's alienated. They'll say, well, I want my child to have a good relationship with the other parent, but he doesn't want to go. So I'm not going to make him go. And they don't realize the reason the child doesn't want to go is because of their intense emotions. They made the child not want to go, and they can't connect the dots back to their own behavior. So mirror neurons, just talk quickly about this. They reflect what the other person's doing. They reflect emotions. They explain a huge swath of life, from emotional contagion and social synchrony to how infants learn. So social synchrony is how children synchronize with their parents. And infants especially follow their parents' emotions to know how to react. A stranger walks in the room and mom tightens her grip on the child. And the child realizes that's a dangerous person and bursts into tears, doesn't have emotional regulation. Or a person walks in the room, a stranger, and mom laughs. They go, oh, good, I like this person already because mom likes this person. So we emotionally learn. They say the first couple of years of life that the right brain's developing rapidly and that the children are following their parents' emotions to know how to respond to things. It's not till they're about 2 years old when you start getting language kicking in more substantially that the left brain really gets going. That's a lot of where our language processing is. And they start connecting things to words, etc. But they first are learning emotionally, and that's so important to understand. But they can't process it. So a parent's intense anger, they can't suppress their response or reinterpret it. So cognitive reappraisal, that's what adults do. It's not about me, it's about her. I'm not going to get upset. And that's what I learned as a therapist, that if my client was angry with me, my job was not to get angry back, but to empathize with them and try to help them understand what they're feeling and how to manage their emotions. So as an adult, we can do that. Although it's harder the closer we are to people, like family members, we often just mirror them back. But we want to try to regulate so we don't do that. The healthiest families have everyone self-regulating their emotions. So emotions are there. We need emotions to connect, but they're not at that level of intense negativity. That's when you start seeing people get alienated. So you could tell yourself, it's not about me, it's about her. Her unmanaged emotions are inappropriate. As an adult, you might think that, and that may be why you got divorced or separated as parents. Emotion suppression, I'll just hide how this hurts me and smile. You can do that for a limited time. You can do that in the office. You don't want to have to live that way at home. But children can't do that. And that's so important. Children absorb and reflect what's coming at them. So parents intensely angry, the result of those 3 steps, their mood state is anger. Now, who are they angry at? Sometimes children become angry at the parent with the unregulated emotions. I've had cases like that. They don't want to see an intensely angry parent because that's really hard to be around. And so they become estranged from that parent. And I'm going to play some audio clips, give you a demonstration of that in a little bit. So I want to talk about what personalities show these intense emotions. So about 15%, research says, of the US adult population has a personality disorder. A personality disorder is, and it's defined this way, an enduring pattern of behavior that deviates from the culture and shows up manifested in 2 or more of these ways. Cognition, that's the way you perceive the world, other people, and events. Affectivity, and that's emotion. The emotional range may not be very wide. Some people are just angry. Whenever they have another emotion, the next thing they know, they feel angry. We see that in domestic violence cases. We also see that in alienation cases. They have a vulnerable emotion, it turns quickly to anger. It's not even a conscious process. The intensity of emotions, the appropriateness. So you have people with personality disorders, some of them have emotions that are like 1 in 100 on a scale of 1 to 100. It's just 1 or 100. And they're just like, everything's okay. And suddenly everything's terrible. And they're screaming at you. And so children exposed to that absorb that intensity. People in treatment for personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder in particular, has a lot of emotion dysregulation. But therapies for that, such as DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, helps them learn to make the emotional responses fit the circumstances more appropriately. So they learn to manage and to check themselves. Wait a minute, is this anger fit the situation? So it takes a while to learn that, but some people are learning that and no longer meeting the diagnosis of, say, borderline personality disorder after 2 to 5 years of good therapy, like DBT, that teaches skills, not just listening to venting. Venting doesn't generally help those folks. Interpersonal functioning and impulse control. Impulse control might be hitting send on a nasty email that they shouldn't send. It might be domestic violence, hitting somebody. Interpersonal functioning is so important in understanding personality disorders because that's pretty much what it's about, an interpersonal disorder. So personality disorders, research is showing us, are primarily interpersonal disorders. They show up in relationships, especially close relationships, as some research shows. There's been a lot of attention paid now, just really the last 10, 15 years, to the impact of personality disorders on children, parents, siblings, peers, and romantic partners. Well, that's what we're talking about. Our high conflict people in close relationships exhibit behaviors that are problematic. Now, cluster B is one of the 3 clusters of personality disorders. There's 10 personality disorders that mental health people diagnose, and 4 of them are in cluster B. That's antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. And by the way, I want to mention, you're going to be able to get the PowerPoint slides. So especially if you're in a legal case, if you're a lawyer, or a parent representing yourself, if you want to use any of this research in your case, I've shown where it comes from. So you'll have this. These are quotes, and they show a lot of insight. So what they're showing is these 4 personality disorders, cluster B, are known as dramatic, emotional, and erratic. Does that sound familiar with the behavior of people you've been dealing with? Could be. Well, they found that they showed moderate to large and significant associations with domineeringness, vindictiveness, and intrusiveness. Well, that's a bully, someone that wants to dominate, someone who's vindictive, and someone who wants to intrude, kind of get in your head and manipulate how you think. And so we're starting to see this may be where bullies come from. They may have these patterns of behavior that go way back to early childhood that they don't even understand themselves. So we need to understand them so we can stop these behaviors or protect children. Now, personality disorders can be blamers. So people with personality disorders tend to see their difficulties as external to themselves, caused by forces outside themselves. So they feel like victims. They feel like victims in life. And so about half of people with personality disorders aren't going to cause you trouble. They cause themselves trouble, but they just kind of blame the universe, blame the system, blame things vaguely. The ones we see as high conflict, the ones who are alienating, seem to be the ones who have targets of blame and are preoccupied with blaming a specific person for their problems. And that's often who we see in our high conflict court cases. And not just divorce cases. You may see these personalities suing their employers, suing their doctors, suing other people, primarily because of how they view the world as a victim, rather than because of anything the other person did. And that's what you're up against in court cases, is showing that their upset emotions don't actually go with what you've done. They go with what's going on inside of them. But they may be injured. Certainly people with personality disorders have legitimate cases in many cases, but there's many cases where they don't. And they really are exaggerating, or there's nothing there, but they feel it's true. So the impact on children of these personality disorders, especially borderline, narcissistic, and antisocial, was part of a big study. This is actually done in Norway, if anybody's from Norway, but it's published in international journals. What they're saying is children of parents with personality disorders characterized by hostility, and that's what we see in alienation cases, are more likely to develop mental health problems themselves if they have parents like that. The personality disorders that appear to be most strongly associated with hostile behavior are borderline, antisocial, and narcissistic. And then they give a description of the behaviors: difficulty controlling anger, impulsive and aggressive outbursts, rage when being criticized, irritability, aggressiveness, and maybe even physical assault, being tough-minded, exploitive, non-empathic, lack of reciprocal interest and sensitivity to the wants and needs of others, sudden and dramatic shifts in their views of others. So this is this big study of over 900 preschoolers, around 4 and 5-year-olds in Norway, over 900. And they found that when they have a parent with one of these disorders, they're at the mercy of unpredictability. How do they resolve that unpredictability? Well, here's what happens. They said, for the first time, we document, predict behavioral and emotional difficulties as early as preschool age. And when parents aren't both in the same household, in other words, often there's a reasonable parent, but they're not in the household now, the variance of the children's emotional problems explained by parental symptoms of these disorders increased more than 6 times. So when you're alone with a parent with traits of a personality disorder, not even a full personality disorder, that's what this study looked at, was traits, that a child may have many more problems. So this helps us understand what the dynamics are that are going on. So being unpredictable and intrusive is really hard for kids. And so kids have to resolve. They can't stay in a state of emotional dysregulation. They can't tolerate that after a while. So we think of this with infants, they often just shut down. But older kids, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, resolve it by going one way or the other. And then there's peace. So their goal is to have peace. And the way you have peace with a high conflict parent is to give in to them. Now, some kids will escape them and get away from them because of their intensity. But in alienation cases, they've given in to them. And as one of the psychiatrists said, the children, they express emotions in an excessive way, suffer intense negative moods. They are overly dependent on their attachment figures. So this may be mom or dad who's engaged in alienating behaviors and trying to hold the child close to them, and presumably to make her feel more secure, although it could be him. But this is talking about the dynamics of how this works. So these intense emotions are intensely contagious and influence the child to take sides. Now, if they're emotionally in isolation, so they're only with that parent, then they're going to believe that parent, or they're going to fight to get away. That's estrangement. So you have alienation or you have estrangement. But it's the child can't tolerate that. Kids can't tolerate the emotional intensity of a high conflict parent who may be someone with a personality disorder or just traits. But it's this intense emotions that kids have to go one way or the other, and it's not a conscious decision. They don't go, I wonder which way I'm going to go. So this comes down to resistance and refusal to see a parent primarily seems to be because of this emotional overload, although it could be physical abuse also. But with alienation, we're seeing that the child resists for no good reason, but the emotions have hooked them in. Remember, let's go back here. They may be overly dependent on their attachment figure, that's the favored parent, in order to make her feel more secure. Now, this is going back as far as infants. So an infant who has a personality disorder parent with this intensity may already be learning, I have to agree. I have to be overly dependent on mom or overly dependent on dad. And so when the parents split, the child's already used to this process of being overly dependent. A little more explanation. Gatekeeping has become a common word now in high conflict cases, divorce cases, custody cases. It usually was considered a negative thing, and then people started talking about facilitative gatekeeping, and that is true in some cases, especially if a parent's trying to protect a child, is trying to include the other parent and facilitating that. But what's a problem is when we see restrictive gatekeeping, and this is when a parent makes it hard for the child to have time with the other parent, may schedule appointments during the other parent's time, may activities during the other parent's time, etc. And extreme gatekeeping can lead to severe alienation and even child abduction. Now, splitting, that's a mental health concept that's associated with borderline and narcissistic personality disorders. It's seeing people as all good or all bad. It's unconscious. They honestly believe it. And we see this in a lot of alienation cases. The parent says, the other parent is evil or is the worst person in the world. And they may use those words. I think of a narcissistic case. My client was the mother. The father alienated the two sons against the mother, basically saying she's stupid. And so the boys grew up saying she's stupid. And she wasn't stupid, but it came from the father, and that's how they viewed the mother. And the father did a lot of things to just look down on the mother. And she went from being the primary parent to the boys not seeing her in adolescence. And the father actually disappeared with them. And I helped her find him. We got him back to court. He didn't kidnap the kids, but he just made it hard to find where he was and lost contact, and she found where he was. He was still in the same city, but in a house that he bought in the name of another relative. He was someone he was more along the antisocial personality line. So he lied a lot, hid money, got into legal trouble for that. The voice of the child, I want to mention, this comes up, is what about hearing the child's opinion in court, with counselors, with evaluators, etc. And you may hear this term, the voice of the child. This came up with the Convention of Rights of the Child, 1989. Most countries have signed on to this. The United States hasn't, but Canada has. And I believe most European countries and some in the Southern Hemisphere as well. And so in Canada, it's that the voice of the child will be heard in proceedings that affect the child, not just divorce, but adoptions, etc. The problem, though, in alienation cases is what's the child's expressed opinion? Well, the child's expressed opinion is heavily influenced by what Matthew just went through, is figuring out who's the bad parent, who's the evil parent, and hearing all the things that parent says about the other parent has to influence the child. My belief and experience, they talk about is the child able to form an independent opinion. In dysfunctional families, children form survival opinions. And so in alienation cases, you're not getting the child's independent opinion, but the child saying that it is. and the other parent may say that it is. And that's one of the characteristics of alienation, is saying I'm having an independent opinion when in fact they're not. So that's an area that's of great concern, and a lot of times decision makers don't understand, is the child's not just having an opinion, the child's surviving in a dysfunctional family. You have to take that into account. False public persona. So many high conflict people, especially abusive, actively abusive people, may have a very charming exterior. You know, a good example of that, there's recent TV movies about the O.J. Simpson case and the fact that he murdered his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson. And what he presented is he was a hero. He was an actor, a football Heisman Trophy winner, etc. Under the surface, he's beating up the mother. And so you have that kind of thing going on with alienation too. You have a wonderful public person who behind the scenes is very negative towards the other parent, and the child absorbs that. Now, many parents who are high conflict parents also reject one of the children. So you'll see there's a favored child and a rejected child. In Matthew's story that we heard some from, his younger brother Thomas becomes the favored child by the mother, and the mother's treating Matthew as a rejected child. So you see they also do this in how they treat children, not just the other parent. And this psychological process gets emotionally transferred. Now, I want to give you an example that demonstrates the emotional power here. So I had a case where a 15-year-old girl writes a letter to her father saying, I no longer want to have a relationship with you. So the father takes the mother to court, and the father and the lawyer are very angry with the mother, show that obviously, and her lawyer. The judge criticizes the mother, so the judge is angry at the mother as well for purposefully alienating the daughter. I know what you're doing, you're alienating her from her father. What's interesting in this case is the mother insisted that in the past 2 years, she hadn't talked about the father at all, because 2 years earlier, she was told, don't talk negatively about the father. And so for 2 years, she didn't. But what's interesting and tragic about this case is the mother is a very emotional person and constantly tearful. And it's her sadness, tearfulness, inability to manage her emotions, not just anger, but all emotions, that led the daughter to, she couldn't tolerate the emotional tension, to say, I don't want to see the father. And so the judge ordered father-daughter reconciliation counseling, and it failed, as it usually does in these cases, and the father gave up. It's a sad outcome. And I'm going to talk about a better approach than reconciliation counseling with an alienated parent, because that on its own doesn't work, because the problem includes the other parent, the favored parent who's engaged in these alienating behaviors. Let's go to this other example. This is where the mother's the one the child became alienated against. This is the divorce case I mentioned earlier. 6-year-old boy, mother had 2/3 of the time, but father had rights to phone calls Tuesday and Thursday before bedtime, and he'd spend his time on the phone interrogating the son about the mother and the mother's new boyfriend. Is he abusing you? How's he talking to you? What's she doing with him? All of that. Over the next 10 years, every year, the father came back to court trying to get custody. He made child protective services reports against the stepfather that all were unfounded. There were 4 psychological evaluations. There was a lawyer for the child, but he just continued to manipulate the child, very emotionally intense, took the child's side in fights with teachers, classmates, etc., until the son started bad-mouthing the mother, who still had 2/3 of the time. At 16, the boy ran away to be with the father, and the father wouldn't return him, said he's protecting the boy from a terrible, dangerous mother and stepfather. And at that point, the mother gave up. So in both these cases, the parent basically gave up. Sad. So what should we do? Let me just add the tribal warfare aspect. When you have two groups talking to themselves about another disliked group, they move farther apart. And that's one of the problems with litigation of these cases, is the slow process of trying to understand the case. The case often really isn't understood. Some or all of the professionals don't understand. And so it grinds along, swinging kind of back and forth. It's mom's fault, it's dad's fault. And all that time, the child becomes more and more alienated because the parents feel stressed and anxious and angry. And so that passes right on to the child. If there's a parent with a high conflict personality who lacks emotional boundaries. So Janet Johnston reported this almost 40 years ago in one of her books, Impasses of Divorce. So that's 33 years ago. The problem still persists because most people don't understand it as the dynamic process. Professional splitting, professionals get emotional with each other. You may have professionals with high conflict personalities, and they're also splitting, seeing some people as all good, some people as all bad. Professionals have to really protect against that. Focus on what's the behavior and what needs to be done, not who's all good and who's all bad. If we just take out the issue of somebody being evil and say we have a problem to solve here, let's analyze it, that's the way to go. But unfortunately, the adversarial process of court turns it into this battle over who's evil. And that just doesn't help resolve the scientific dynamics of this issue. So what do? You're hoping I would get to this. So here's what I think. And this is what I presented to AFCC, professionals, lawyers, judges, mediators, therapists, etc. From the start, so I'm going to talk about court, talk about dealing with the co-parent, and then talk about dealing with the child if you have contact with the child and if you don't have contact with the child. So from the start of a case, all professionals need to manage their emotions and not allow themselves to slip into this is an issue of good guys and bad guys. Don't look at it that way. This is a problem to solve. This is a psychological dynamics that need to be understood and addressed. Parents and family members should try to avoid the high intensity emotions around the children about the case, especially about the other parent. Courts should admonish both parents from the start about what behavior is inappropriate. And I have a list on the next slide. And with the child, try to avoid being angry at the child for their resistant behavior, because that reinforces that they have to pick sides. You want to be the parent that has empathy. You want to say, I understand this is a hard time. I understand you're in an awkward position. And I know that's hard on you. And I want to do my part to let you know I understand and see what we can do to make it easier on you. Don't agree with the child when the child says, okay, you know, you're a terrible parent, you've done everything wrong, and I want to have no contact with you. Is explain children need two parents to learn and grow. And I'll give you some words to use a little later on. And all of these are suggestions. There's many different approaches. I'm talking about the start of the case right now. So ask the court to make these admonishments. that both parents from the start of the case should not discuss the case with the children. It's so common that high conflict parents just spill out everything, all their emotions about the divorce, about the other parent, etc. Not to show court papers to the children. I remember a case where the daughter came to court. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was 13 and wasn't going to be allowed in the courtroom. There was no plan for her to testify, but she was there. I represented Dad. Mom, we had to give Mom some court papers, or she had come with some that had been served earlier. And she gets them out and goes over line by line with her 13-year-old daughter. She says, I can't believe he said that. And, oh, that's terrible. Just spewing all her emotions right in front of the daughter. So we brought that up in court. Tell the children when hearings will occur. They shouldn't even know there's going to be a court hearing. Tell them the other parent has a problem. We'll have one case, my client had a sex addiction, but he was not a pedophile. He was not sexually attracted to children, but he admitted he had a sex addiction and he went into treatment for it and really did very well. But mother says he has a problem. I can't tell you what it is until you're 18. And got the kids so terrified of the father that they were scared to be in his house. Interfere with the other parent's time, including activities, appointments, family, friends. These are all things they should be admonished not to do. Compare parenting abilities or traits. Remember the mother who wasn't good at math, but dad was great at math, that kind of thing. Discussing financial issues. You know, I can't go anywhere because your father isn't paying enough in the child support. Or I can't go anywhere because I have to give your mother all my money. Those kinds of things. That shouldn't be said to the children. Children shouldn't know anything about finances. Children should be allowed to be kids. Yell or cry about the other parent. And as I explained, crying about the other parent can be just as powerful as saying angry things, because it's the intense emotions, and the children can't handle the intensity of the emotions, so they resolve it by taking sides. Of course, don't ask the children to report on the other parent, you know, or discuss the reasons for the divorce, blaming the other parent, etc. So when I speak to judges, I give them this list, but I don't know how much this gets used. This is preventive, and ideally it would get communicated. Now, 3 theories of the high conflict case. One of the questions that was sent said, what do you do when, says, I have an alienated child. She said she was no longer going to bully her the night she left. That I was no longer going to bully her. Says, but I wasn't bullying, says the person who sent the question. I was parenting. And I've had cases like that when you set limits and the child says, oh, I'm going to go be with the other child. I had a recent case like that. A boy had his cell phone taken away, so he got the other parent to pick him up and take him to the other parent's side, and the other parent went along with that. Said, you know, mom's bullying me, mom's being a parent. And so anyway, how do you deal with bullying when the person doing the bullying is actually hiding behind someone else and calling the target of the bullying the bully? And that's what this is meant to address. So if you can communicate this to evaluators or to judges, they have to consider 3 theories or 3 possibilities in a high conflict case. One is, yes, parent A says parent B is abusing the child when you're not. And that's why the child doesn't want to go with parent B. So consider the theory, parent B is acting badly, maybe a bully, look into that. But equally consider the theory, parent isn't acting badly, isn't being a bully, and the other parent is acting badly. and projecting onto them, and that's alienation. Or both are acting badly. So because that's what judges most commonly interpret cases as. Both parents are acting badly and just go away and stop arguing. So this is called confirmation bias. If they have one theory and they fit your case into that theory and it's the wrong theory. So when they have one theory, that's confirmation bias. They'll interpret the information to fit their theory, even though it's probably wrong. So this is tricky, and I encourage lawyers to present this. If you're self-representing and you're in court, this is something you may want to briefly mention and say, you know, I realize that in a high conflict case, the court has to consider three possibilities: that there's allegations against me. One is that they're true. Second theory is they're not true, and it's the other way around. And the third theory is it's both of us. Well, Your Honor, in this case, it's the second theory. In this case, I'm not being abusive. The other person's engaged in alienating behaviors. And by now, I think most people know, avoid the phrase parental alienation syndrome, because that's been rejected by most mental health professionals, and therefore courts have not adopted that. But the dynamics are still there. And so address the behaviors. So alienating behaviors is something courts will pay attention to generally, and they can see that, you know, mom scheduled something during dad's birthday, you know, scheduled a doctor's appointment during dad's birthday when he had the child. Well, that's an alienating behavior, things like that. They can get that. Syndromes, avoid that. So countering them, so if you're in a court case, keep in mind that these high conflict parents or bullies or people with cluster B personality disorders who focus on targets of blame communicate emotionally, and that's why they're so powerful in court. It's amazing how they're able to persuade judges, evaluators, etc., of things that are really a distortion because they communicate emotionally. And so emotional words, simple words, repetitive words are persuasive, but they're often not accurate. So what you need to do is use some mildly emotional words, but communicate, look reasonable. Don't look like you're just totally frustrated and distraught, even though you may be. Is you want to be the reasonable person who's helping the court with information that's useful. And so what happens, and I recommend, is you bring it down to 3 or 4 key concepts that you're going to repeat. And they're simple, they have some mildly emotional words, and you support them with facts. And so here's an example of that. So when I consult with people, I ask them, I say, what's the biggest concern? What's the biggest type of behavior that you're seeing? And so in some cases, it's physical abuse of the child. In many cases, that's easier because it's more clear cut. But many cases, it's emotional abuse of the child, and that's an emotional word, and use that. See this short phrase, emotional abuse of child, and then give the most important examples. Don't do it chronologically, do it by the worst examples. And I recommend that if you're hiring a lawyer or preparing for court, that you write like a 2-page summary of your biggest concerns so that the lawyer or you can repeat those so people actually absorb it. When you think of judges, typical family law judge has about 3,000 cases. Now, many of those they don't see because they just settle out of court and it's just under their list of cases. But many of those cases they do see. So how are they going to remember your case? we're going to have an emotional phrase that's short and simple and gets repeated, but doesn't seem extreme. So saying emotional abuse of children is something that gets attention, perhaps. This is a common one, undermining fathers or mothers' parenting. And you can usually go back to details about this. And so this is a way to communicate that. And then you come in the future and the judge says, oh, wait, isn't this the case of undermining the mother's parenting? Well, they've absorbed your pattern, your heading, because they've seen it several times and you've supported it with facts. So you need to give examples, but like a date if you can. See, like I did with physical abuse, I had dates. So if you have dates and then briefly what happened. And then manipulating and lying to professionals. In so many of these cases, the parent who's really being a bully is manipulating professionals or lying to professionals. Some of them will fire therapists that don't agree with them. Some may go through 6 or 7 lawyers because the lawyers realize this just is going nowhere. Or simply manipulating or lying to the court. And I always recommend you get transcripts of all court hearings so that you can show if they lied to the court at a prior hearing and say what the facts are. A lot of judges will tolerate parents lying to each other, but when you lie to the court, that really offends them. So that kind of information. But if you organize all your information, maybe you got 10, 20, 50 pages of information, organize it under the key 3 or 4 headings so that those will get remembered. So I recommend you write a 2-page summary of your case with 3 or 4 headings with examples like this. I have a 1-hour webinar on writing for court on our website, highconflictinstitute.com. It's for lawyers or self-representing people, and it explains this idea. If you have 10, 20, 50 pages of information, still organize 2 pages. So by the 2nd page, the evaluator or the judge or the lawyer that you might be hiring can get what your case is really about. Because if it takes 10 pages to explain that, by the time they get to page 8, that might be real important, but they've lost their attention. And someone's come in the room and distracted them, or they felt their hunger and now they're thinking about when they're going to have lunch or dinner. So 2 pages summary on top of all the information, and then have the rest of your information focused on these categories. So you keep seeing this phrase, oh, there's another example of manipulating and lying to professionals. And so many of the cases that I get consulted on where someone's losing their case, it's because the other person's manipulating and lying, but they didn't want to say that. And I find it helps to say that so the court's looking at that as a possibility. I wonder if they're manipulating and lying to me. If you don't raise that possibility, then all they think about is that you're acting badly, or maybe not, but they don't think about the other person. And that's an important principle in family court cases, is to understand that in many ways, the court really can only look at one person. There's a spotlight on one person. Either that person's acting badly or they're not. And I've had many false allegations cases where the judge goes, okay, I'm convinced that didn't happen. And it stops there. They're not looking at the other person. The other person is someone who's manipulating and lying. They need to look at that explanation for what's going on. If they just look at whether you're acting badly or not, and don't look at the other person, the case doesn't get really understood. So you realize you have to help them look at both of you. So that's why saying this may be helpful. Of course, none of this is legal advice. You should always talk with a local lawyer and make decisions working with them. Another is to have the courts order skills for training both parents. Now, if you're a reasonable parent, this is a way to get the other parent exposed to some skills, maybe some counseling. So we developed a method called New Ways for Families, and it teaches 4 big skills. It's designed as a counseling method. It's also an online class, and we also train coaches for the online class. Each way teaches these 4 big skills, which go against alienating behaviors. So flexible thinking. Well, alienating behaviors are all or nothing. Managed emotions. Well, alienation is this exchange of intense, unmanaged emotions. Moderate behavior. Well, alienation itself is an extreme where you reject a person. That's extreme and that's not real life. It's not the way people should learn to solve problems. And checking themselves. We teach making proposals for negotiations, managing emotions, and our BIF response method for emails. These all take the edge off of high conflict behavior. And that's why we ask the court to order both parents, so no one has to be defensive that I'm the bad guy. And if you're reasonable, this gets the other person exposed to this stuff, and it won't hurt you because it gives you skills for dealing with them. In many cases, settle after this. So we do that as a counseling model, 6 individual sessions with each parent, then 3 parent-child sessions. It's all guided by a workbook. We've had some reconciliations in alienation cases this way. I'll give you the example of one. A 15-year-old girl hadn't seen her father for a year. Parents were ordered into New Ways for Families, the counseling method. Each parent went through 6 individual sessions. Then the parent-child sessions came. The first one was with the favored parent, and the counselor, the parent-child counselor, helped the parent discuss with the child that she needed to attend the next week with the father. Child said, I don't want to see him ever again. And the counselor and the mother said, this is part of what the judge has ordered. You need to do this. And mother said, I'll get in trouble if you don't do this. So please do this. And supported the child meeting with the father. She was skeptical that it would be beneficial, but she said, I support your relationship with him, and that's up to you and he to work out. So the girl came to the first session with her father, and her father had been through the 6 weekly sessions, so was prepared to manage his emotions. And the girl spends, 15, 20 minutes telling father everything he did wrong. I hate you, you did this wrong, that wrong, you ruined my life. And so says all of that, and the father says, thank you. And the daughter like, what? He says, thank you. She says, you're not angry? I just told you you're a terrible person and all that stuff. He says, no, I'm glad we're talking. Tell me more. And so they reconciled, and he managed his emotions, hearing all her negativity. And I think they regularly had dinner together once a week. I don't think they went to a 50-50 schedule, which was his preference, but they regained their relationship. And I don't know if it grew from there or how it went. But that's our goal with New Ways, is to help people communicate and have relationships, whatever the schedule ends up being. The online class, 12 sessions, Orange County judges in California have ordered over 3,000 parents to take our online class. And most of them don't end up going back to court. They're able to resolve their cases. But the judges say if they do come back, that their body language is different. They're less adversarial. So if you want to get your co-parent to be less adversarial, try to get this ordered and just volunteer. Say, order it for both of us. I'm happy to take it. I think it's less than $100. So actually, if you go online, it's $139. It's called Parenting Without Conflict, but we have arrangements in some places where it's under $100. Go to our website, conflictplaybook.com, and I think that's under 100, but it's not court mandated. The court mandated ones are $139, but that's for 12 hours. That's a good rate. Then we have coaching with that, where you pay a coach for 3 coaching sessions along with the online class. We also developed it as a decision skills class, 3 sessions with a workbook. Some people are doing it around the country, I don't know where. Mostly it's the online and coaching with the online, and some places it's the counseling model. Now, I can show you a clip here, so let me hold on. Going to switch to video, which has to be optimized for Zoom. And let me get this, get the right size. I think this is, oh, I see where I am. I'm sharing, but I have to make it full screen. And
any reason to change the temporary orders before they start step 3, parent-child counseling. Let's take a look.
All right, welcome back, Mr. Terrell, Ms. Terrell. Mr. Benjamin, what's the status of the case today, sir?
Thank you, Honor. Both parents have attended New Ways for Families for 6 sessions each. They have no agreements at this time. However, there's been a new development since the last hearing. The children no longer want to visit Mr. Terrell. My client is therefore requesting that until Mr. Terrell secures some professional treatment for his abusive behavior, that the visitation cease.
All right, thank you, Mr. Benjamin. Mr.
let me just mention before we go further. So the father, Mr. Terrell, has hit his son with a belt for not getting his homework done during the parenting time and pounded on the screen door till it fell off its hinges. So those are the 2 abusive incidents. The judge has ordered a restraining order and ordered both parents into New Ways for Families. And now he follows up to see what they got out of it.
Terrell, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like you to tell me what you've learned from your New Ways counseling. Then I'm going to ask you for a response to what Mr. Benjamin has just said. But let's start first with what you've learned, sir.
I've learned that I can't use a belt in disciplining my son over his homework just because that's how my father did with me. I realized that I let myself become too rigid about the homework at the moment, that I need to plan ahead better. I need to be more flexible in my thinking. I've learned that I can help my kids a lot, even if I don't have a master's degree like their mother does. If I start to become stressed, I can calm my emotions down by remembering that, reminding myself that I really actually am a pretty good parent in lots of ways. To supervise visits, I've been trying to focus on the kids and what they're into at this age. And I know I was too uptight and competing with their mother, and because I missed how much they really enjoyed being with me.
Well, I'm pleased that you've learned these things about yourself and your children. This, I genuinely believe, will help you, sir, over the years. I'm glad to hear that you realize now that using a belt was not moderate behavior. Let me ask you now, what would you do in the future if Ms. Terrell refused to allow you to see the children? Would yelling and pushing on the door be moderate behavior in your eyes now? What could you do instead?
No. I know now that yelling and pounding on the door are not moderate behaviors. I'm checking myself now, and before I'm doing anything in dealing with Ms. Terrell, now I would call up a lawyer that I've been talking with and ask her what to do. I wouldn't even go over to her house, our house. Now I would calm myself down and I would call the lawyer.
Good. I'm very glad to hear that you're checking yourself now.
So I'm going to skip ahead to him asking the mother.
So far has been temporary without reached an agreement about the. And tell me why you think the children don't want to spend time with their father.
I've learned that I should not express my feelings of sadness or anger about Mr. Terrell around the children as it upsets them. I've learned that my feelings can be contagious and that the children might become sad if I'm sad or angry. I've tried going into my room and screaming into the pillow with the door locked so that they won't hear me.
All right, thank you, ma'am. I'm glad you're learning to check yourself and to protect your children from your upset feelings. This is very important, I believe, for their future, to know that both parents can cope with big challenges without exposing them to the full intensity of their upset emotions. Now, let me ask you, what would you say in the future if Mr. Terrell did something you didn't like? Would you yell in front of the children that they didn't need him in their lives? Would that be moderate behavior in your eyes now? What could you do instead?
No, I realize that yelling is not a moderate behavior. I've tried very hard to protect my children from how upset I get sometimes. A moderate behavior would be going into my room first and calming down.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to finish my PowerPoint and back to my slides. Hi, I'm Bill Eddy, president of the High Contact. Actually, we know that. So let me get the slide. And so many of the questions that I was asked. So I talked about explaining what to do with court, trying to add to the court. So in dealing with the other parent, some of the questions were, should we keep track? Someone said, is it appropriate to document, share the alienated child's negative behavior towards the targeted parent with the alienator? Example, the child says, I don't want to come here anymore. Mom told me to talk to you about that. So the problem is someone who's engaged in alienating behaviors is unlikely to be someone that's going to have empathy or insight. And so pointing out that the child's absorbed their behavior, they'll just be defensive, and there's a good chance it could make things worse. So you really, it's a judgment call. You've got to be careful about that. Remember, these folks aren't generally doing this as a plan. This is their personality. This is who they are. They see you as an adversary, and what you have to tell them, they're going to generally reject regardless. So it needs to come from somebody else if they're going to behave better. That's why we recommend getting court orders for both parents to learn skills, either coaching, counseling, or online. Because it can't really come well from you. It's rare. I don't want to say don't ever do that, but I would say I've never seen it work. You have to realize you're dealing with someone with a fully defensive personality. So dealing with the co-parent, we have a method called BIF for emails. If you're emailing, BIF for co-parent communication. We have a special book for co-parents, BIF for co-parent communication. It's been #1 for much of the past year on divorce and separation family law on Amazon. But now, last, I want to talk about what you do with the child. So first of all, give a lot of empathy, attention, respect to the child. Try as with the position that they're in. And a lot of adults who then reconcile and talk about when they were kids say, I didn't know what I was doing. I felt I had to do what I was doing. I thought you were really evil or bad because I heard so much, like Matthew did in the audio clip. And so empathize with them. Be the reasonable parent, because if you're both angry, they'll have to pick one of you. But if you're the reasonable parent, there's a lot of kids that switch sides at some point. Sometimes 18, 19, 20. They go, I want to live with you. And then they want to stop contact with the first parent, the one who was alienated. And you want to tell them that's not healthy either way. It's not healthy to reject people that you're close to as a way to solve problems. Of course, it's up to them if they're an adult, but don't encourage that. Encourage emotion management. Talk about choices. We could talk now, we could talk later. Talk to me, talk to a counselor, somebody else for overcoming that. So if they're back with you, you want to not push them and have them, take sides the other way. More than anything, teach the 4 big skills for life. These are flexible thinking, managed emotions, moderate behavior, and checking yourself. And any parent can teach this to any child starting at any age, really, by like 4 years old. And this helps go against alienating behaviors because it's flexible thinking. Alienating behaviors are all or nothing. Managed emotions. We need to manage our emotions. Johnny, you saw that guy on the TV show. Do you think he was managing his emotions? No way. We're learning to manage our emotions. Then Johnny comes back from the other parent and says, mom or dad was so angry this weekend. And you can say, well, we know it helps to manage our emotions, and you and I are working on managing our emotions. That way you're teaching this skill, not bad-mouthing the other parent, but it helps the child interpret what the other parent's doing as really not appropriate. So that helps with that. And we have an article at the end of this book, the BIF for co-parent communication. We have an article on teaching these skills. The title of the article is What to Tell the Children About a High Conflict Co-Parent. So it's in there. And lastly, or next to last, so keep communicating. This is something many people encourage. With an alienated child of any age, cards, letters, don't flood them with stuff because that builds their resistance. But send cards, certainly holiday cards, birthday cards, a letter. Make a copy because someday you may be asked, well, what did you do? Did you really try to reach out to me? Did you try to help me? And you can say, yeah, this is everything I sent. Well, I never saw it. Well, now you can read them. Keep it light. In other words, share personal experience. This week I went to, such and such place. We had a great time. Something interesting you learned recently. Or a friend, you might remember, Sam Smith, our neighbor. Oh, I saw him the other day. He's been living in a new state for the last 2 years. He said to say hi, so I'm saying hi. Keeping it light, not involving discussion of the case, etc. Just have a nice, positive, light interaction. Share your successes. Be successful in your work, in your life, so that the child sees, well, I've got this anxious parent that I'm living with, and then I got this other parent who actually seems pretty happy and doing pretty well in their life. Gee, I wonder, which one I want to learn from. And we have some cases where people go, yeah, I'm going to move to that parent. If they say you've done terrible things, don't buy into that. You haven't done terrible things. No one's done something bad enough they shouldn't have a relationship with their child or grandchild. And that's a big myth that alienating people reinforce. And the importance of having two parents.